Welcome back to the IoT For All Podcast. Thanks for being here this week.
Hi, Ryan. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I mean, at this point, you probably don't need any introduction, but it might be good to just give a quick intro to yourself and Transforma for our audience, who might not be unfamiliar, new listeners, those kinds of things.
Yeah, of course. Matt Hatton, I'm one of the founders here at Transforma Insights. We're a analyst firm focused predominantly on IoT. We cover a bunch of other technology areas as well. Quite a bit about AI, more on which I think a little bit later on, and some other areas as well. So yeah, a boutique analyst firm, should we describe ourselves?
You all are fantastic. We've had the pleasure of knowing you all for quite a while now, as we've built IoT for all, and you've moved through different stuff in your career and into Transform Insights, and obviously we're always big fans. So it's great to have you on, and we're going to kind of have a very similar episode to what we've done in the past, where we try to bring you in at the start of a new year, start of a new quarter, and talk about the things that you're seeing as key trends, stuff that the listeners and the audience should be paying attention to or expect to see kind of come up in that upcoming time period. And I know from your standpoint there is a lot of things going on heading into 2025, a lot of topics that are going to become kind of top of mind for people if they're not already. So my goal today is kind of let's run through some of those topics, have you just touch on them, and then I'll jump in with some questions here and there, but it'd be good just to kind of run through those for our audience.
What we like to do is kind of get ahead of that question a little bit, because that's always one that we get quite regularly. What are going to be the key themes? What should people be looking out for in the course of the year? And over the last couple of years, what we've done is right at the start of the year, we've published what we call our transition topics, things that we see as being the maybe not only relevant for that year, but things that sort of bubble up to the surface during the course of that year, which will be key decision points or trends or whatever that might be important to think about in the course of the year. And so we've done that for the last couple of years. This year we actually published our list for 2025 in November. Maybe we're a little bit early on that, thinking about it. I mean, who knows? Things change very fast in IoT, right? So 2 months ahead of time, well, can we be sure that that's going to be the things that are going to be relevant in 25? But we figure we've got a pretty good idea what it's going to look like, and it influences our research agenda, right? So we think these are the important things, and so they're going to be the topics that we're writing reports on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And some of these topics I know if you've been in the IoT space for years, have been things that have seen the origins of these topics, right? So a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about isn't going to be foreign to too many people, but it's going to be good to kind of update them on where things are with these topics like 5G, AI, eSIM, et cetera, and just make sure that people know what matters and what they should be kind of looking forward to seeing hopefully progress and potentially, like you said, bubble up to the top as a key kind of topic next year. So the first one I want to jump into is kind of the biggest one I think people talk about right now, which is around AI. So integrating AI into IoT. So talk to us about kind of why that is such an important topic, what that means, and then we'll go from there.
In fact, the first two of the transition topics relate to AI. The first one being the concept of AIoT. This is one that's been sort of circulating around a little bit for a few years. The idea that there's a sort of overlap between the two areas. AI being obviously the hottest topic in technology at the moment, and IoT maybe being a little bit more of the old guard. But I think it's relevant that you can kind of think of the reasons for doing IoT is about remote monitoring and management and so on. And then you kind of get to the next stage, which is automation of process. And if you're automating things, then you're potentially introducing AI to enhance that automation and speed it up and so on. So we figured, okay, we'll look at this in rather more detail, how you embed AI onto IoT devices with a view to a sort of augmentation of the IoT proposition and adding a set of enhanced product features and functionality and so on board the AI, onboard the IoT device. And that might be things like video analytics. You can anticipate using video cameras for a whole load of IoT applications, and in some cases, and this is something that we've written about over the course of the last year, using video as an alternative to IoT sensors.
More of the computer vision stuff, right?
Exactly, and actually it can act as a replacement net. But what's sort of implicit in that is you've got to do quite a lot of deeper analytics on what's going on with the video images, and a lot of that's probably going to require, what do you say, computer vision and some element of AI in there. And so what we found ourselves doing is looking at, okay, well, in this universe of IoT, what what can we expect in terms of the adoption and use of AI on those IoT devices? And it's something that we've got ahead of a little bit in terms of, we talked about as a 2025 topic, but one of the things that we just ran a webinar about early December was this concept of AIoT, and we've just published a report on the scale of the AIoT opportunity, you might think of it as, without wanting to go into too many details. And check out the webinar. I already encourage people to have a look at the webinar. It's listed on our reports and insight page. So if anybody wants to go take a look at that, they can. It's free. They just need to sign up for an essentials subscription, which is free, and you can access that. But the thing is, something approaching a quarter of IoT devices by 2033 will have some form of AI on them. And that can range from, TVs making use of it for content suggestions on whatever, through to autonomous vehicles, through to industrial automation. There's a whole range of use cases. Typically, the most common is around natural language processing, video feed processing and analytics. But the natural language processing one is pretty obvious for things like smart speakers, right? I mean, it's a well understood use case with that. But the fact that this starts accelerating even more across a whole range of other use cases, I think is pretty interesting. Hence why that's one of our big themes of research for the coming year.
Yeah, so it sounds like one of the things I think a lot of people have questions about is what does it even mean when we say bringing AI into IoT, right? What capabilities are there that this now enables? Because at some level, IoT devices, when they collect data from the physical world, there is something that is being done from a computation standpoint with that data for the end user to get value, right? So I think that's where people kind of get hung up the most is when they hear AI. It's such a broad general topic. Like, what is that functionality? And you kind of articulated that well with some of your examples here with natural language processing, stuff with the video analytics and just the compute and what it's able to kind of take that data and what's able to be done with that data is kind of where that AI is what they mean when they're talking about bringing AI into all this.
Well, there's also people have been talking about edge compute for quite a long time, right? This idea that you put a lot more of the intelligence out at various points of the network, maybe on the edge device, maybe somewhere a little bit closer in order to get that processing happening closer to the application. And there's no reason why one of those shouldn't be actually on the edge device as part of the application itself. And in order to speed that up, you want some of the processing happening in more or less real time. And really, applying AI is the optimal way to do it in some circumstance.
With cameras too. I think that's going to be where you've already mentioned that, but that's a big area with vision. Being able to do that at the edge, like on the device itself, on the camera, being able to identify some type of action, some type of event.
Also, if you think about the latency that comes from if you were to try to process everything in the cloud instance or whatever, you haven't got the immediacy of action that you would have if you were able to push it out to the edge device and have the automation going. So, and actually that brings us quite neatly onto the second one of these themes, which is around the management orchestration of AI. If there's an expectation that AI is going to play a whole much more significant role in what's going on with IoT devices, well, the question is, where does that AI sit? And we have this concept of subsidiarity, where it sits at the level at which it's most appropriate for it to sit, and that might be at the device itself, it might be at the network edge, it could be on campus, it could be a range of different locations. But there's then a question of, well, how do you manage all of those resources when you've got storage and processing and the need to update the instances and all of these various functions and kind of orchestrate across all of those different pieces. And I think there's still a job of work to be done to work out how you do that in an optimal way, rather than just saying, "Oh, we'll do AI." It's like, okay, well, where and how do you manage that, and what's the most optimal place to locate it, and how do you orchestrate between all of those? So that's another one. Not one I've necessarily got the answer for at this stage, right? So when we set these topics, a lot of it is saying, here's a bunch of questions that we maybe don't necessarily even know the answer to, but it's going to form the basis of a lot of the stuff that we do over the course of the year in terms of digging into them and understanding what the implications are.
Well, and it brings it to the surface for companies that are building these devices and using these solutions to have to be thinking about those pieces, right? So that those are all the parts that are going to really come into play that might not be thought about necessarily. Let me ask before we transition, I want to get into kind of connectivity topics next, but so AIoT, do you think that's an acronym that sticks around? We've been hearing it kind of here and there. Obviously M to M to IoT. Do you think we transition away from IoT into AIoT, or do you think it like it's its own thing? Do you think it doesn't really pick up steam? What's your prediction?
We were a little bit hesitant about using it, just, I mean, for the simple reason that, okay, what does the I stand for? Is that artificial intelligence of things, or is that artificial internet of things, or what? Because in a way, it sort of doesn't work, but then also we kind of also know what we're talking about. So we're using it as a shorthand for making use of AI on IoT devices. Will it pick up steam as much as the other terms that we've generally used? Almost certainly not, I would say. But I think we wanted a handy term to throw at this thing that we were talking about, and that seemed to be the, the best one we could come up with. Although I have to admit we were a little hesitant.
No, it makes sense. It's a valid point with what does the I stand for? But yes, we have been seeing it more and more. So it was just more of a fun question to get your thoughts on because we're thinking about the same thing. Is as we cover more AI topics, does IoT make sense to be the thing we lead with from a brand standpoint, or does somehow we need to incorporate both into that, right? Because that's where it's all going.
It's true, and the other thing that we found was we've always had a sort of hankering to get it much more into this AI space, but how do you? There's too much to bite off as a completely extensive topic, and which is touching just about everything you can possibly imagine in the technology space, right? So, how do you start talking intelligently about AI? Well, I think the most sensible thing is to carve out the bit of AI which is directly relevant to the core area that you happen to look at yourself. And in that case, for us, it's largely been IoT. So if we start looking how it impinges on IoT, also how it impinges on networks. So we do a lot of stuff around telco and so on. And so looking at that aspect of it as well, also an important thing. And we did publish a report, one published and one coming through the, the sausage machine at the moment around how AI can be applied to networks, and also how telcos are able to monetize AI, add AI into their service proposition, and so on. So that's another angle to it.
So the next few topics are all kind of in the connectivity space. So talking about new eSIM orchestration, monetizing 5G for IoT, decisions around LPWAN, satellite IoT, all topics that we've had some exposure to in conversations on the podcast. So take us through those and why each of those is so important to be kind of paying attention to or thinking about.
Some very interesting stuff going on at the moment. Next transition topic was eSIM orchestration, and that's related to the arrival of STP32, the standard which will finally be with us with all of the appropriate minutiae of the standards done and dusted January, February sort of time. And I think we've probably discussed it ad nauseum on previous ones, but effectively this is a standard that makes it much easier to re-credential a device to be connected to different network operators based on downloading eSIM profiles onto that device. Now, as a technology, Um, it's it's very good. It streamlines the process of switching profiles on the device, all very interesting. But actually, the thing for us that leaps out is the potential that it has to actually represent a bit of a sea change in um, how the market's structured, almost in terms of who the providers are of the various capabilities. And what we're gravitating towards is that actually this means that there's a more fundamental, I'm going to say, structural separation, which sounds very grand, um, but there are three roles effectively, and this is all to do with cellular connectivity, right? So the provision of cellular connectivity. So you've got someone has to run a network, fine. That was ever thus, right? Someone's always had to run the network. Then there are people who resell connectivity from those network operators, so the MVN. And then there's also a sort of eSIM orchestrator role, which was kind of combined with the reseller role, or the equivalent of was kind of combined with the reseller role as what the IoT MVNOs used to do. We kind of see a group of those companies that we would have categorized as IoT MVNOs more gravitating towards that kind of a role as eSIM orchestrators. They want to be a connectivity platform. They're not really that interested in reselling connectivity. They want to be a sort of software layer that sits over the top, providing the customer with access to whichever networks they want to get access to, rather than reselling from a particular vendor, particular operator, right? And so you can see some of the IoT MVNOs, the likes of Teal and Soracom and OneOT and SI and a bunch of these other companies were much more kind of gravitated towards that kind of a role, and we think that that's quite interesting. And there's also at the same time a set of companies that you might have thought of as sort of uh, IoT abstraction platforms, single pane of glass type platforms, companies like Symmetric and IoTM kind of moving into that space from a different angle, as in an enterprise platform that's all about supporting the customer to switch around between whichever connectivity might be the most appropriate. And so you've got kind of companies coming at that from different angles. And at the moment, it's a bit of a well, I published a LinkedIn article about it a few weeks ago about how this is starting to emerge potentially as a market dynamic. But I think the interesting thing to explore in 25 is going to be exactly what that looks like, how that manifests itself, whether it really manifests itself very quickly or not, and the extent to which actually things maybe don't move that fast, or there's almost always a diversity of approaches, and that's just one of the approaches that sits in there. Or maybe it disrupts the whole thing completely, and we've got a whole new set of market dynamics just off the back of this kind of an approach. It will be very interesting to keep an eye on that one.
And the next one was around kind of monetizing 5G for IoT. How will this be done? What does that really mean for people that might not be as familiar?
And this is another one where we've got ahead of things a little bit, because we just published a report early December where we came out with our perspectives on what the opportunity was for mobile network operators in 5G IoT, and specifically just the connectivity side of things, right? So this is not about selling consulting or full stack solutions or anything like that. It's just, okay, well, you look at the connectivity piece of your revenue, what proportion of that's going to come from 5G versus 4G, and in some cases, earlier generations as they still exist, but might be transitioning out. To what extent do these connections actually need the capabilities that are delivered by 5G as a whole, and 5G standalone particularly? And there we're thinking about um, there's a whole load of features within 5G which can be pointed at IoT. So things like network slicing to give you ultra low latency, or there's quality on demand features, or there's this enhanced mobile broadband. It's super high bandwidth for applications. Thing is, and this is the analysis that we just recently published. Um, our calculations based on, we've got these super granular market forecasts, right? So our starting point is we know, or we've got a pretty good idea where all the connections are going to be, what the applications are, and what they're likely to be doing with their connectivity. And we go down through this list and we compare and contrast that with the features that are enabled by 5G, and we kind of work out, okay, well, which ones of these are going to make use of this extra high broadband capacity and then ultra low latency and all of this sort of stuff. And the ultimate finding was actually the vast majority of these connections are when they do shift across to 5G, and they will all shift across to 5G, they won't really be making much use of the 5G functionality.
That was always a question is like, is it how appropriate is 5G? And I think that comes into like all these other different, connectivity technologies that are out there. And then you get into NB-IoT and LTEM and all, other stuff that was kind of built for IoT, but obviously the things are changing there as well.
When you think about NB-IoT and LTEM, maybe there is a clear benefit that's delivered there in terms of the low cost, long battery life. Okay, so that is inherent. Those are inherently capabilities which have opened up the market, expanded the market opportunity, and therefore there's a sort of demonstrable benefit from having those capabilities. But when you start getting into the 5G standalone, have you turned on your 5G core and enabled all this additional functionality? It's pretty hard to point to many examples where you can, hand on heart, say, I think this is going to generate a whole stack more additional connectivity revenue. There may be adjacent revenues associated with running video analytics applications and a whole bunch of other things. But in terms of the pure connectivity piece, it's relatively limited. And then our perspective was, and we tried to put some numbers on this, what does it mean for a network operator's revenue? And the conclusion was that the vast majority of connectivity revenue from IoT is going to come from 5G, but almost none of it because they need the 5G and particularly the 5G standalone capability. So 5G standalone based on IoT connectivity generates like an additional 0.4% revenue for the network operators, which, it's not going to come right into the rescue of justifying 5G standalone upgrades. That's for sure. But it's certainly an interesting theme, but most of it is really around future proofing, and that's not to say there aren't other benefits, right? We're completely not looking there at what the opportunities are associated with some of the capabilities for handset users, like some of the APIs for location and authentication of the users and all sorts of things like that. So there's some big benefits associated with that. So we're not looking at that. We're just looking at the IoT piece. There's also cost benefits. Running a single network, you get better spectral efficiency from 5G, and so maybe that's reducing your costs associated with it. So it's certainly not the sole decision factor.
So let me ask then, how do you think operators are going to approach this given the current options in the market? So talking about like public LPWAN technologies you have, do you see more consolidation in the network offerings that are available for the IoT space because of what 5G can possibly do? Or I guess maybe just the operators wanting to focus more on that and pivot away from other technologies. And LoRaWAN is something that we've covered a lot, but I think there's some questions out there of the viability of it long term. And are people still as excited about it outside of the LoRaWAN ecosystem community of itself? And how should people be thinking about what might happen there?
Or get onto LoRaWAN, there is this question around LTM and the IoT and so on. And I think obviously the headline grabbing news was AT&T's decision to end of life the NB-IoT network. Now, we should say it's only ever been two operators that have ever done this, right? So NTT Docomo made that decision back in 2020. AT&T has made that decision this year, like a few months ago, right? But that is the two biggest operators in the world's second and third biggest IoT connectivity markets, right? So this is a significant thing. But what it does is, I think, reinforces that the economics for IoT stack up much better if you're piggybacking on a network that somebody else is paying for, i.e. smartphone users, than if you've got to implement a technology specifically for that connection. And that was the problem that the likes of Sigfox certainly ran into. LoRaWAN, I think, also runs into it. Don't get me wrong. I think LoRaWAN is a great technology deployed in a private network environment, easily manageable. It's got the roadmap doesn't evolve at the enormous rate of knots that the 3GPP roadmap evolves at. It's pretty steady and linear. It's got a pretty healthy ecosystem around it, and so it's got a lot to recommend it. But what's become quite evident is that there's not really that much of an opportunity for public deployments of LoRaWAN. I mean, there's always going to be some exceptions. It sort of depends on what the market momentum is like. If you win a few smart metering deals, then you can justify anything. So, and that's come back to that topic of NB-IoT as well. There's all sorts of speculation that, or does this mean the AT&T dropping NB-IoT? Does that spell doom and gloom for that as a technology? And the answer is, well, it sort of depends, right? If you're sitting in Spain where they've got millions of smart meters using it, and every one of the breakdown car beacons that they're going to be selling next year that every car has got to have, so it's something like 30 million cars are going to have these things. If you're sitting in Spain, you're thinking, well, we're fine. It's definitely this network's definitely going to be around for the long term. It fragments a bit. You'll have countries where it absolutely makes sense and countries where it doesn't, and so it becomes much more about national deployments, I think, rather than anything deployed globally. It's already a patchwork to an extent, and so that may be just a continuation of a theme that we've already seen. I mean, so ultimately, I think it does all evolve onto 5G, and the advantage with 5G is that is a network that is being paid for by by smartphone users, and the equivalent of NB-IoT and LTM on 5G will be sort of native 5G functionality. So it's sort of already baked in there, but that's not here today, right? People talk about RedCap as the equivalent, but RedCap is really the equivalent roughly of about LTE Cat 4, and the battery life is nowhere near what you get with NB-IoT or LTM, and the costs are still very, very high. So it doesn't sort of hit those sweet spots for the low power technology. So you're left with a bit of a gap if there's no NB-IoT LTM, and you're going to wait till further iterations on RedCap into not even the next one, which is eRedCap, but like couple beyond that probably, before you get something that's actually usable. Or cheap enough and long enough battery life to use for these applications. Well, you do have a bit of a gap, but you've got decision points around all of these, and that was kind of our transition topic for this year. Wasn't really the technology itself, but more that companies are going to have to start making decisions about, well, which technologies we're going to go with, what are we going to prioritize, how are we going to approach this.
So then how, I guess, transition to our next topic here is around satellite IoT. So how do you see that disrupting the space? I mean, this has been a topic that has been discussed for a while now. It hasn't, I guess, been mature enough to be something that people seriously bring into certain solutions. We're starting to see it combined with other connectivity technologies to kind of create more coverage for certain use cases. The cost is for some is still pretty high. But where do you see that disrupting things and evolving next year?
I think this is the one where we've probably got the biggest question mark. And we talked quite a lot last year about NTN, non-terrestrial networks, which is the 3GPP, effectively narrowband IoT from space. And then you might start getting the new radio from space, a proper 5G from space. You've got all sorts of approaches with say Starlink getting involved in supporting direct device, and sort of threatening to do something about IoT as well, potentially. And I think we're sort of on a cusp, and maybe it's one where there was a lot of noise in 2024. 2025, what will be interesting to see is how some of those dynamics with the companies that have deployed LEO satellites, like, well, Starlink being the perfect example, how might that be pointed at IoT? Will it be pointed at IoT? What's the dynamics there? So we'll see with that. And I think there's also a question of how quickly can companies get these NTN offerings to market. in a meaningful way? Um, and is it, as we suspect, that this is really just about, it's a sort of value added service layered on top of the provision of a regular terrestrial connectivity offering, which says, okay, well, in the 1% of cases where my device won't connect to a cellular network, it can fall back onto satellite, if you like. And maybe it's just as a sort of enhancement onto the regular terrestrial. But to be confirmed, we got a pretty good idea of what was going on in that space in 24, but I think it's worth very much keeping an eye on in 25.
What about regulations in IoT? That's always been a topic on people's mind. What's kind of happening there?
Well, I would say that was probably our number one for 2024, as in, is all these regs coming through. You've really got to be aware of what they are, and that's regulations to do with particularly security. We've seen a whole rash of security related regulations to do with labeling and to do with obligations to do firmware updates and various other things. But there's also things to do with data sovereignty. There's also rules coming through about national resilience, as in how do you architect your application? And for instance, in some countries, you need to architect your application if it's supporting critical national infrastructure. And let's face it, most IoT probably could be categorized as critical in a lot of cases, right? How do you architect it so that it works in a closed border situation at the most extreme example? And so there's a requirement to really give some careful thought to making sure you're compliant with whatever the regulations are, and also kind of whatever the regulations might end up being, because we're starting to see a, a greater degree of obligations being placed on companies to comply with certain rules. And I'll give you another example, right? There's the EU's Data Act. There's now an obligation as of October sometime, I want to say, an obligation for anybody who's a provider of IoT services to make the data from their client's application available to that client to take off to any other service provider they might want to use. And great. I mean, you might get a sort of secondary market in data in IoT services, but again, it puts an obligation on that company to have the structures in place in order to be able to support that. So that, there's a whole stack of things around, and by extension, and this is another one where we've actually got two of our transition topics kind of focused similar related things. So there's another one which is geopolitics and polarization of markets, is how we've termed it, right? I mean, at a very basic level, you've got increasing restrictions and considerations around supply chain, bill of materials, which vendor selection. There's been quite a lot of words, and also some regulation kind of pending from the US about the use of Chinese vendors within certain well, connected car, but more broadly. And so I think we've got there's likely to be quite a lot of implications for the things like auditability and traceability and a whole bunch of things there. So that is one that there's certainly a lot of uncertainty about what the market dynamics are likely to be, and could have some quite significant implications for how companies might do their procurement or their obligations in that respect. So we're keeping a very close eye on that one particularly.
This is one that we've talked about a lot on here and really been big advocates for, just calling out and making sure people understand this. But the verticalization of, or in IoT, right? Talking about how the one size fits all approach, trying to create that horizontal platform or whatever it may be, is not necessarily the most sustainable path for companies. And we've seen that transition to more vertical specific kind of horizontal platforms to very now vertical specific solutions, applications, components that are built and marketed towards certain verticals. I assume you all are kind of seeing something very similar to that, is kind of where we're going and what is required, especially on the buyer side of this.
back to a couple more fun topics here, Ryan, rather than talking about the serious regulatory stuff, right? So yes, this is this idea that all IoT is vertical. Nobody really thinks of themselves as buying IoT, right? If you're a utility, you're buying smart grid. If you're a supply chain company, you're buying fleet management, or you're buying track and trace, or whatever. So they never really think about themselves as buying IoT anyway. And the requirements are all different of all of those use cases. And so, IoT is kind of a useful umbrella term that we use to kind of lump everything under. But for the customer, it's not necessarily particularly that useful. And I'm conscious that both of us have made all of our business on the back of that three-letter acronym. So you've got to be a bit hesitant about criticizing it too much, right? But um, everybody's coming at this from their own particular vertical standpoint. And if you're a supplier in the space, you've got to understand that, and you've got to talk their language, and you've got to have a proposition which is optimized for whatever the requirements might be of the verticals. Now, are you going to be able to have a proposition which optimized for every vertical? Almost certainly not. And are you going to be able to market yourself to every vertical, talk the language of every vertical? And the answer is probably not. And okay, trade shows. You want to go do the trade shows? You're going to do every single trade show for every single vertical. You're going to carve off a few and say, okay, we'll do the EV charging ones, we'll do the utilities ones, or we'll do the healthcare shows and the retail shows, or whatever. Right? Just as a sort of microcosm of it. It doesn't take a genius then to work out that actually probably most companies which might think of themselves ostensibly as being horizontal providers and are kind of need to do a bit of a shift towards focusing on verticals. Certainly, maybe not to the exclusion of being able to sell across the board, but certainly to focus their attention, and also to contextualize, right? To take the horizontal proposition and contextualize it for the vertical that it's going into. And I mean, 5G, perfect example of that, right? You've got all this functionality. If I'm a retailer, what's the relevance for me of all this weird and wonderful functionality that might be applicable? Well, you have to have it translated into your language to make you understand what it is that's useful about it, rather than just saying, look at all this amazing technology we've got. Won't it be great for you to use for your, I don't know, cash registers or whatever? I don't know, but you go away and work it out. That kind of approach doesn't really fly, right? You've got to put it into context. And we saw this, you mentioned platforms. We saw this in the platform world, right? You had all of these companies that thought, okay, we're going to be this all-encompassing universal IoT platform that's going to be relevant for everybody. And there wasn't space for it. There wasn't enough interest. There wasn't enough momentum or understanding of what the specific market requirements of those verticals were for it to take off. And then everything sort of verticalizes.
The last one is kind of optimizing sales. What does that exactly mean? Like, what are the things that you kind of focus on there?
Yeah, we're thinking here about market segmentation, channels, partner programs, these kinds of things. Because one of the main questions I get asked is, how do I sell more stuff? Right? I mean, that's pretty much what everybody wants to know in pretty much every line of business, right? So it's not that surprising that that's a question I get quite often. And the answer with that is, well, first of all, you've got to understand, what are you selling? Who are you selling it to? What are the personas of the people that you're selling it to? What's the best mechanism for getting to those personas and getting to those companies? And it's not just a case of saying, okay, well, what's the entirety of the IoT opportunity? In fact, this is related to the verticalization issue as well, right? But not what's the entirety of the IoT opportunity, but okay, which bits are relevant? Which bits are relevant to my proposition? Where have I got something that's better than most others might have in that space? How do I get to those companies? Is it direct sale? Is it online channels? Is it managed service providers and resellers? And which ones of these mechanisms for selling to those organizations is the optimal one to do? So this is more about a refinement of sort of commercial approach to addressing IoT, recognizing the reality that the market is incredibly fragmented, and also just within that fragmentation, there are different ways to skin the various different cats. That's not particularly tasteful metaphor to use, but that's the one I started on, so I'm carrying on with it. Um, so yeah, bit more effective market segmentation, bit more effective channel strategy, implementing effective partner programs, and so on. I think it's just a recognition of more realism in what the opportunity looks like, and trying to sort of just optimize the commercial approach.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that. Kind of those, especially those last two areas. This stuff, we talked about kind of leading up to those. We've covered before, and it's good to kind of see the progression and the maturity of a lot of those things happening, and just stuff like the regulations, and the geopolitical dynamics that are happening. It's important to understand how those might come into play. But I guess the big thing for us is we always love seeing what's going to contribute to the most adoption, which I think is what's going to propel the industry forward. Any other topics outside of these top 10 that we've discussed here going into next year that are worth mentioning before we wrap up?
Well, we'll continue doing a lot of work around all the various verticals and what the dynamics are of those. One that we've just picked up as an interesting theme that one of our clients mentioned the other day was around the theme. In fact, this is kind of a regulatory theme, but know your customer rules for connected car. This is certain specific markets have rules around what the know your customer rule are, and then you've got all sorts of dynamics around uh, how the connected car services are procured and who they're procured by, and therefore who's the customer, who needs to register, and so on. So that's an interesting one that we'll be doing some stuff around just in the new year. I'll be doing something around LoRaWAN, a bunch of stuff around satellite. I've mentioned all the things already. We have our regular CSP benchmarking report coming up which will be out in the summer, which is looking at what all the network operators are doing. And I'm sure there's a dozen other things that I'm just not immediately thinking of, but yeah.
Thank you for taking the time. This has been a great conversation. I know our audience is going to appreciate kind of this breakdown very much so. So yeah, thank you again for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime.